Screen culture is, as its name suggests, a whole way of life revolving around the digital devices. So when we say screen culture, whilst I wouldn't exclude television, it's more the interactive nature and the mobile nature of digital devices, which of course can embrace interactive TV nowadays. But it's more specifically when you think about the amount of hours people spend either with their Xbox or their laptop, or indeed their mobiles, or perhaps even nowadays with Google Glass.
Message via your Google profile. Heading to San Francisco. Message. Hey Drew, heading down to make our fare next weekend.
So I can reply to it, of course.
I'm going to show you how to navigate while walking. Lead the way. Let's listen. Okay, Glass. Get directions to park.
Okay, Glass. Make a call to Rekik.
Is somebody calling me?
Try, okay, Glass, answer call.
Okay, Glass, answer call.
By screen culture, I mean literally that, a world of two dimensions where for 6 hours a day or more, people in the Western developed world, more particularly kids, are spending time either playing games or on social networking sites, and thereby putting themselves in an environment that is very much in the here and now, that has very strong audio and visual sensations, where at the press of a button you get instant feedback from whatever you're doing. But at the same time, you're perhaps removed from some of the aspects that we've taken for granted, things like metaphor, abstract concepts, logical narrative, conceptual frameworks, long attention spans, imagination. But it's primarily a world of a small child, a world of the here and now, a world of a soundbite, a world of an instant frozen moment where nothing has consequences and where everything is literal, where nothing has a meaning. You're not seeing one thing in terms of something else. You're seeing literally what you see is what you get. As a neuroscientist, the reason I'm particularly fascinated, and I think in equal measure both excited and alarmed by the impact of screen culture on the human brain, is because, as a neuroscientist, I know that the human brain is changing. It's highly plastic, as we say. That's not to mean it's made of plastic, of course, but more that it's very dynamic, it will adapt to the environment.
If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well-travelled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep travelling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action.
So this is what was meant by plasticity. And one example, for example, a very famous one, is of piano players, where they had 3 groups of adult human volunteers, none of whom could play the piano. And even over 5 days, you could see that whereas the controls, who were just staring at the piano, showed no change in their brains. The brains were literally unimpressed. Those people who were taught 5-finger piano exercises showed an astonishing change in brain territory and functional area relating to digits, even over 5 days. But the even more exciting group were the third people who just imagined they were playing the piano. And astonishingly, their brains showed the similar changes to those that had done the physical exercise. So I think this shows you how everything you do, even a mere thought, in inverted commas, will literally leave its mark on your brain. And therefore, if that is the case, if we are so sensitive in adapting to the environment, if the environment is changing in an unprecedented way, as I argue as it is with the cyber world, then it follows that the brain will change in a similarly unprecedented way.
Well, it's clear that even people who have, like me, who started off without the web and now use it, work differently. When we want to think of something, we tend to often just reach for the keyboard because we have assumed that we can find stuff. Now, people say, I don't know, that they've measured that people are not remembering so much. I don't know, but I know that the way I work very often assumes that I can go for my computer helper, for my web as a helper. The web is an extension of my brain. When I'm roaming, so my little interface to the web is too expensive to use. I feel as though suddenly I've got one hand turned behind my back because the usual sort of instinctive reaction to whip it out, I have to hold back and try to actually think things up.
I think the price we pay for having easy access to so much information, easy, quick access to so much information is we sacrifice some of the depth of our engagement with that information. So the kind of jumping, hopping from bit to bit to bit, clicking on links, takes the place of what used to be a more contemplative, I think, approach to thinking about one thing, whether it's one piece of information or the argument or the narrative of a book. It becomes much harder, I think, when you're bombarded by information and other stimuli, as you are all the time on the web, to sit down and really focus on one particular thing. And so we gain kind of a breadth of engagement with information, but the cost is, I think, a certain superficiality in our relationship to that information.
How many of us can relate to this experience? Living vicariously through the computer, jumping from one thing to the next. Multitasking, digitally tethered. Looking up something, only to end up somewhere else completely unrelated. How many hours have you spent looking up fleeting curiosities? And how much of it do you remember? What do you take in? How many of us think through the global computer? And how has this already changed the way we think, feel, read and write, learn, understand, and remember? What does this mean over time if we go on like this?
Throughout my life, books have played an important role, and I've always found it easy to immerse myself in a book and get engaged in an argument or a narrative. But a few years ago, as my use of the web kind of picked up, I found it much harder to sit down and engage with a book. After a page or two, my mind would start wandering. I'd kind of lose the focus, have to go back a page to reconnect with the argument. And at first, I thought, okay, maybe this is just general, age or something that's causing this. But what I noticed is that the sensation I had when I tried to read or really concentrate on anything was that my brain, my mind, wanted to behave the way it behaves when I'm at my computer or online. It wanted to check email. It wanted to click on links and jump from page to page. So it really, I began to make the connection that, in a really an unmistakable way, my use of the net was changing the way I think, in changing my ability to do things like concentrate or contemplate one particular piece of information or read through 100 pages of a book. And I began talking to other people, and many of them, not all of them, but many of them had a very, very similar, were suffering from a similar type of affliction. They felt that they had increasingly scatterbrained, and they wanted to be online.
One of the biggest problems affecting the human brain in the 21st century is multitasking. And the research we've done over the past year or two that got a whole lot of attention was multitasking seems to be very bad for the brain. Not just while you're doing it, but there are lingering long-term effects. So people who multitask chronically, people who multitask all the time, seem to be less able to distinguish relevant from irrelevant information, seem less able to manage their memory, and seem less able actually to switch from task to task. So what this tells us is if we're designing interfaces to encourage multitasking or to support multitasking, we're actually creating a worse thinking, poorer thinking group of people. And it's very worrying.
If you look at the way the internet bombards us with stimuli, not only hyperlinks and different pages of information, but alerts, from Facebook updates to Twitter alerts to, incoming email and even our phones going off all the time, it creates, in a sense, an environment of information that plays to our desire to be distracted. And so it becomes very difficult to keep a focus on anything when 5 different things are happening at once on your screen or between your screen and your smartphone and so forth. And it's just all sorts of environmental stimuli that come through this information medium and keep us pretty much permanently distracted.
So you're reading an article online when you get an instant message with a link to a funny photo, which of course you have to share. And now you're reading your Facebook news wall, which sends you to a video of a panda bear attacking a kid. And now you're reading Wikipedia to learn everything you can about the violent behavior of panda bears. And this is what 3 minutes on the internet can be like.
I've often spoken about the benefits of screen culture being one of agile processing, but how that mustn't be confused with content. Now, there's a book written a while ago now by someone called Stephen Johnson called Everything Bad is Good for You, which extolled the benefits of screen culture. And one of them is that it could be linked to high IQ, because the skills that you rehearse when you play video games are similar to those that are required to do well in IQ tests. That's to say you don't need a lot of facts or infrastructure or hinterland, but you do have to be very agile at looking at patterns and connections and getting to an answer in a rather fast time frame. So the idea is that because the human brain is always good at what it rehearses, if you're rehearsing that, you're going to be good at it. And so then you go to an IQ test and guess what? You'll be good. But even Stephen Johnson says, just because, as many claim, we're seeing an increase in IQ scores in certain societies, we're not seeing an increase in empathy or understanding. Or insights into the economic woes of the world or the Middle East crisis. No one's suddenly come up with their superior cognitive abilities with insights that we would regard as important. And I think what you need to do, therefore, is on the one hand, yes, it's very good for mental processing, for what used to be called fluid intelligence. That's to say, where the emphasis is on giving a right response to an input. But that's not the same as understanding. Information is not knowledge. And I think this is what people confuse. And by knowledge, I refer to content. And content, for me, is true intelligence, which is where you can see one thing in terms of another. So, for example, the bit in Macbeth, out, out, brief candle. In order to really understand that, you have to see the analogy between the extinction of the candle and the extinction of life. You can't just say, take a candle literally. And I think that that's what we are missing out on. That's what might be in jeopardy. That's certainly not enhanced by doing very fast, clever things with video games, even though you might be able to give impressive responses very quickly, correct responses very quickly. That's not the same as understanding, and I think we have to be careful about differentiating them. Following on from that idea, we think about learning. And let's take the example of the British Education Minister recently said, yes, young children now, everyone should learn a poem. And I think that's wrong. I think the emphasis should be they should understand the poem. So really what we need is not just to access facts, but we need to see one fact in terms of something else. So facts on their own are pretty boring. You know, who cares the height of a mountain or the date of a battle, the name of a king? These things are only relevant if you relate them to others and you see a trend and you can generalize, or if you're learning the name of a king, you know more about that king and why he was important. So a fact on its own, which is why Trivial Pursuits and pub quizzes are not held up as the pinnacle of intellectual achievement. Facts on their own are not the same as interpreting the facts, putting the facts into a framework, and even more important than facts are ideas, and you do not get automatically ideas coming out of an iPad. You won't have that. You'll have access to facts, but it requires an inspired teacher, it requires your thinking processes, it requires something in addition for you personally to join up the dots, and that's for me, real knowledge.
So can we join the dots with this then? The fact that the screen culture has become more pervasive than ever before, and that we're increasingly spending more and more of our time in this virtual world. A world which encourages distraction, shallowed thinking, short attention spans, and a world where we don't have to remember anything anymore because we can just look it up on Google. Can you see this as one thing in terms of another?
I think we are becoming more and more stupid. We don't have to work our brains so hard. Any information we need to know, we can instantly find it on an internet search system. And the worst thing would be to have a USB portal into our brain, so it's there immediately. Because the moment you take that away, you're dumb. You haven't got any information, you're relying on it.
Recently there was some work done by someone called Sparrow, where she claimed that we were changing our memory processing because you can just look something up on Google.
The overall findings are that when people don't know things, they tend to think about the computer first. They think about the place to find it. When people expect to have information accessible to them later, they don't remember it as well as when they don't expect to. So they do locate it externally instead of internally. And then finally, yes, that people tend to prioritize where to find things as opposed to the things themselves.
And that does concern me because let's take that ad absurdum. If you feel you can look anything up and you don't have to learn anything, this would mean conversation is going to be pretty clunky, because if I normally meet someone of roughly my generation and culture, I will assume they know where Barcelona is. I'll assume they know who Napoleon was or who Henry VIII was. I'll assume they know where New York is. Yeah? So you can have a conversation, and we all know the delight of having conversations with people where you share a lot of background knowledge that can develop ideas. But imagine having a conversation with someone who knew nothing, who didn't know who Hitler was, who hadn't heard of fascism, who had to look it up each time. This would mean that you couldn't really have a very fluid or interactive conversation. And I know that sounds extreme, but if we are always having recourse to an external source of memory, then I think it's going to have a severe impact on how we interact, how fast we have ideas, and what we do with them. And I think that the younger generation perhaps might be disadvantaged in not having such ready, agile processes and have a much more cut and paste mentality.
Oh, maybe there's a... Did I see the lineup for cars? It's getting wasted. The Empire State Building is like really close to it.
I'm a little nervous about drawing a sharp distinction between what we call, Generation Web or digital natives and older people, adults, because I think that's that lets adults off the hook, and they can say, as they always say, this younger generation, they're, going to hell or whatever. And really, the effects of the internet, I think, are the same on adults as on younger kids and younger adults. So I would hate to make it seem as though older people aren't affected by the internet, because I think they are. And I think what we see in young people, the distractedness, the inability to, read more than 2 pages at a time, is probably coming to characterize older people in every generation as well. Having said that, I think obviously the human brain is malleable throughout the course of anybody's life, but it's particularly malleable, of course, when you're young. So if a person is brought up looking at screens and using the web and being bombarded by information, then the question is, will the brain circuitry necessary to do things like deep reading, deep thinking, will those circuits ever even come into being? Will they be wired for that kind of thinking, or will they be wired completely for internet type of thinking?
We are so perhaps transported by the experience of accessing Google and of surfing and of watching YouTube, most of which has no real significance. Watching a dog as a trick cyclist is so what? Watching people planking, watching the Harlem Shake. Why are we doing this? It's because the experience of it is obviously, by definition, pleasurable, but we're not doing it to find anything out. We're not on a quest anymore, because we know we can go on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And this, in a sense, the means has outpaced the ends. And I think that, again, this will have serious implications for education.
I think that's the big fear, is that we'll end up with a generation of people who are very good at using the net and very good at finding information and processing information very quickly, but don't really have any capacity for contemplativeness or for concentration or for deep engagement with information. I think the great value of thinking deeply and reading deeply and concentrating in general is that we begin to develop a unique personality, a unique intellect that's ours and ours alone. And that requires, I think, deep thought and in the ability to make our own associations and our own connections about things we understand deeply inside our own mind, rather than relying on the associations and connections that might be out in the world and that we might access through hyperlinks, for instance. So I really think that the human self and the human personality becomes much richer when we can slow down and when we can think deeply and engage with information in more than just kind of a cursory manner.
Did the Giants win last night?
Will I need an umbrella tomorrow?
No.
You think no?
This is no longer a generation that lives deliberately, that lives its life, that lives in the moment. I think that has time for reflection. We ask ourselves questions. If the velocity and volume is such that I send you a tweet or I send you a text, you have to answer me back. You can't. Nobody answers a text by saying, I have to think about that for 2 weeks. The communication demands a response. Well, that means that we start to ask each other questions that are easy to answer. And so I think we live in a kind of paradoxical time, and we're giving a whole generation a very paradoxical message. The world is more and more and more and more complex. On the other hand, we're only going to ask you a question that you can answer in 2 seconds. So we leave ourselves less and less time for reflection because our communications media push us to quick responses. And quite frankly, the questions before our planet right now are not questions that should be answered or thought about in the time space of texting.